Hi, Miss Dice. Sadly, the other ways I have recorded this are not working. Anyway, so I did my project on why racism is perpetuated in America, why it still exists today, and why the president or politicians want you to believe that it does not exist. So, systematic racism since 1965, since the abolition of slavery. After the ratifications of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, Black and brown Americans still were targeted and denied basic rights. The abolition of slavery was honestly a short victory, and it led directly to the Black Codes and the segregation era that were designed to recreate slavery as much of an accurate degree as possible. After receiving citizenship and even into the 1900s, far into the 1900s, they've experienced extreme difficulty receiving housing loans, healthcare, unemployment, and education. So, to explain systematic racism, it refers to the ideas of white superiority being captured every day at a systems level, taking a big picture of how society operates and who it favors. This would include large issues like segregation, but also examples of government systems considering white needs as the default or top priority. White individuals don't have to be racist to contribute to systematic racism, or systemic. Rather, they are blindly benefiting from systems that privilege white faces, voices, and opinions. So this presentation is about post-civil rights era and modern day, but it's important to address segregation in the 1950s. This map also, it's important to note, looked very similar to this even in the 1960s. So in order to marginalize Blacks and keep them separate from whites, and also erase the progress they'd made during Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws were established in the South beginning in the late 19th century. Black people could not use the same public facilities as white people, live in the same towns, go to the same schools, interracial marriage was illegal, and most Black people couldn't vote because they were unable to pass voter literacy tests. Again, this is after the 15th Amendment that grants Black men the right to vote. So, the Civil Rights Movement, it was a drastic response to segregation, and it began in the 1940s and continued through the 1960s. It was an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights under the law. These groundbreaking movements included protests by Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine, which led to Brown v. Board, and the Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIA, led by Martin Luther King, and many more. It's important to note the goals of the civil rights movement. This is why I included it, because it applies directly to my presentation. First, of course, was equal rights under the law for Black people. But second was demands for pre-existing laws to be enforced and applied to all states. Just like we talked about before, voter rights needed to be enforced even though the 15th Amendment was supposed to guarantee that to them. This is the reason why, the fact that these laws aren't enforced is the reason why racism is still around today. So the impact of the civil rights movement. On September 9th in 1957, President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This legislation was the first civil rights one since Reconstruction, which just further shows you how neglected Black people were in the early 20th century. How this allowed federal prosecution of anyone who tried to prevent someone from voting. Yeah, wow, 80 years later, and this still needs to happen. So, the lack of enforcement of these policies led to further sit-ins such as the Greensboro protest, Freedom Riders movement, and the March on Washington led by Martin Luther King. Again, we see the lack of enforcement of policy, which leads to the continuation of the civil rights movement. President Lyndon B. Johnson later signed both the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, quote, guaranteed equal employment for all, limited the use of voter literacy tests, and allowed federal authorities to ensure public facilities were integrated, or ending segregation. He also passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned all literacy tests. Now, are these laws as good as they seem? No. Yes and no. Of course, these laws are excellent, but we need to see how they have translated to modern-day America. These stats, which are hard for you to see, they're hard for me to see as well, says that most Black adults have negative views about the country's racial progress. For example, this first one says that 71% of Black people say race relations in the U.S. are generally bad. These are all adults. 73% say Trump has made race relations worse. 78% say our country hasn't gone far enough in giving blacks equal rights with white people. And 50% say that it is not likely that black people will ever have equal rights in America. So, why are so many people frustrated with the dismissal of post-civil rights racism? Let's start with the political impact and disadvantage. The first major leading political impact is redlining. The reason why I put redlining in the political category was because it's like a political institution, like the idea was perpetuated by policy to do this. So redlining is the act of denying housing loans to minorities when applying in majority white neighborhoods. This is just one form of perpetuated segregation in modern day America. It leads to poorer areas being majority black, which leads to low-income schools being majority black, which extends into our workforce and representation in our workforce. Although improvements, as you can see on this chart, have been made, black people still have a much harder time of getting approved for conventional mortgages, and they also traditionally pay higher mortgage rates. You can see here the 2000, starting in the 2000s, this chart, it shows 44.6% for African Americans, and if it's that high in 2000, you can imagine what it was in 1980. So continuing on redlining, the term comes from physical maps created by loan companies as well as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, where red sections of the maps were highlighted areas where loan issuers were encouraged to deny loans to minorities, while blue sections were highlighted as predominantly black and Latino areas. All right. Next, we move on to the lack of representation in politics. Representation is crucial when it comes to policies and lawmaking. It is the most effective way to destroy a system that benefits white people first. Again, we are living in a system that was created solely by white representation. That system has been edited and changed, but for the most part, our longstanding policies did not have anywhere near equal representation when they were being created. Currently, African Americans are still largely underrepresented in their own communities. This chart shows the blue dots of underrepresented councils and the gray as represented. Again, I didn't really want to speak on police brutality today, but when instances like this happen, it is much more frustrating, I've learned, for African American people to call for change in their local governments when their local governments do not accurately represent them. That just leads to further frustration. So, environmental impact. I thought there wasn't going to be much environmental impact, but sadly there really is. The University of Washington did a study on St. Louis, who was a great example of environmental risks being exposed to black communities in much larger proportion. This study showed that African American residents in St. Louis are exposed to far greater environmental risks, which contribute to disparities in health, wealth, and quality of life. This quote by the unnamed author of the study says, "It should come as no surprise that black St. Louisians are disproportionately harmed by lead poisoning, asthma, mold, high energy costs, all of which are associated with factors such as substandard housing conditions and air pollution. Due to living near industrial facilities, highways, and building demolitions," the report cites. In addition, the city's focus on enhancing majority white areas has left majority black areas without adequate access to public transit, health, or food, or healthy food, and with high concentrations of vacant properties and illegal trash dumping. Again, this is a representation of a white majority government, maybe even unknowingly, disproportionately improving white majority neighborhoods. Social inequality. Major white supremacy groups still obviously exist today, including groups like the KKK and the alt-right. These groups largely contribute to social acts of racism with their white superiority agenda and belief system. Another major reason why racism is perpetuated in America is because of the denial that acts of social, political, and economic acts of racism exist today. An example being the lack of government action taken against groups like the alt-right when they commit acts of violence. A major example of this would be the, what was it called? Oh no. The protest led mainly by the alt-right in Charleston, Unite the Right, the Unite the Right protest, where counter-protesters were murdered, run over by a car, and the government refused to address this group, the alt-right, as a domestic terrorist group, while they are quick to address Antifa as a domestic terrorist group. Not that I would ever support Antifa, but the comparison and the hypocrisy is definitely there. So how the economy favors the majority. The Center of American Progress notes that, quote, the U.S. economy was built on the exploitation and the occupational segregation of people of color. People of color still remain largely overrepresented in low-paying jobs. Again, this is perpetuated by the, here I said futile system, but it's also a feudal system that keeps African Americans in low-income neighborhoods with less standard education system and lack of resource. Here we see a chart to display that further. Further on wage inequality, when you look at a wage by job, the more African Americans in a workplace, the lower the pay. This more accurately describes the wage gap in America. This directly affects women as well. We see, when we look at wage trends by gender, we see that, by gender or by race, we see that women as well as minority races are paid less in these jobs, and the mean income of these jobs goes down when more minorities are doing those jobs. So, kind of to wrap up, there is injustice in silence. Certain politicians want to convince the country that racism ended. This is one of the greatest injustices currently by the government. It is manipulation, and it is wrong. Remember, when they say that civil rights acts ended racism, that they said the same things about Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, separate but equal laws, and the, quote, end of segregation. Do not let these power-hungry, money-hungry politicians convince you that racism ended with Martin Luther King. Yeah. So what must be done? At a government level, policy and action must be done to stop the systemic racism integrated into our society. That also starts with more representation in our government. On a personal level, check your privilege. Take an objective look at your life and the policies that might be affecting you disproportionately. Obviously, that only applies to privileged people in America. Ways that you can support the POC communities are going to protests or town halls, calling your local city officials, or letter writing campaigns. Persistence is key. Black people do not have the privilege to be silent on these issues or to give up on these issues. Let them set aside. Be persistent in your communities. Go out of your way to show compassion and fight for the rights of POC and minority communities. And to reiterate, white people have the privilege to be able to turn a blind eye. That doesn't mean that you have to use it. We have the ability and the privilege to turn away from this issue and to continue to benefit off of a justice system and a political system that was created to put us first. But that isn't justice, and it isn't right. And just to go back to persistence is key. Continuing to fight for these issues, continuing to go to protests, it is so crucial. And being at the protests this weekend have just opened my eyes even more to the realities of what it is and what it means to be a person of color in this country, to be unheard, to be rejected, cast aside, and to have acts of violence committed against you by your own government. It was horrifying to see. And that's why I didn't do my presentation specifically on that, because I realized how little I know about what it means to be a person of color that faces the possibility of police brutality in this country. Yeah, okay. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you.